Caleb Maupin is a journalist and political analyst based in New York City. He has reported extensively from the Middle East and Latin America and has made frequent appearances on RT and Press TV. He's also the founder and director of the Center for Political Innovation, and his book is called "Breadtube Serves Imperialism: Examining the New Brand of Internet Pseudo-Socialism." There it is. And it's all about your favorite YouTubers and how they serve imperialism. And let's welcome Caleb Maupin. Hi, Caleb. Thanks for coming on.
Sure. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So I want to just talk about Ukraine with you for a little bit and what's happening with Russia and Joe Biden and then the gas situation. And then we'll talk about your book. So let me just show this. So this is what's called a gaffe when Joe Biden says the quiet part out loud. So here's what he said.
For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. God bless you all, and may God defend our freedom, and may God protect our troops.
So there he is. This man cannot remain in power. So there he is. He's giving away the game, which is regime change in Russia. And that was a gaffe, right? And so here he is. He has to walk it back. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken, other officials walked back Biden's remarks on Putin ouster. The president said the Russian leader cannot remain in power, but the U.S. has clarified it's not pursuing regime change in Moscow. Secretary of State Antony Blinken reiterated the U.S. was not pursuing a strategy of regime change in Moscow. And here's Michael Tracy saying Biden called for regime change in Russia wasn't some off-the-cuff gaffe. It was declared as the climax of a carefully choreographed legacy-defining speech in a deliberately chosen venue, Poland, where the call would be well received. The message was delivered loud and clear. And Biden tells U.S. troops they'll be in Ukraine. This is what want to hear what he said here. Here he is.
And you're going to see when you're there. Some of you have been there. You're going to see. You're going to see.
You're going to see when you're there. You're going to see when you're in Ukraine. That's what he's talking about. That's the president of the United States, totally demented, trying to start World War III.
Women, young people stand in the middle of front of a damn tank, just saying, "I'm not leaving. I'm holding my ground." They're incredible.
So there he is saying that U.S. troops will be in Ukraine soon. And here he is doubling down on that we have to have regime change.
Do you believe what you said? Thank you, sir. Do you believe what you said, that Putin can't remain in power? Or do you now regret saying that because your government has been trying to walk that back? Did your words complicate matters?
Well, you asked 3 different questions. I'll answer them all. Number 1, I'm not walking anything back. The fact of the matter is I was expressing the moral outrage I felt toward the way Putin is dealing in the actions of this man. Just brutality. Half the children in Ukraine. I just come from being with those families. And so, but I want to make it clear, I wasn't then, nor am I now, articulating a policy change. I was expressing the moral outrage that I feel, and I make no apologies for it.
So now he's trying to pretend that I wasn't really speaking. I'm the president of the United States. And when I speak, people shouldn't take me seriously. That's what he's trying to say. But he's trying to also say at the same time, I'm a badass and I'm not taking it back. Just don't take me seriously. That's what he's saying. Okay. Biden's reckless words underscore the dangers of the United States' use of Ukraine as a proxy war. This is from Glenn Greenwald. The central question for Americans from the start of the war in Ukraine was what role, if any, should the United States government play in that war? A necessarily related question, if the U.S. is going to involve itself in this war, what objective should drive that involvement? Prior to the U.S. jumping directly into this war, those questions were never meaningfully considered. Instead, the emotions deliberately stoked by the relentless media attention to the horrors of this war, horrors which, contrary to the West media propaganda, are common to all wars, including its own, left little to no space for public discussion of those questions. The only acceptable modes of expression in the United States discourse were to pronounce that the Russian invasion was unjustified and, using parlance which the 2011 version of Chris Hayes correctly dismissed as adolescent, that Putin is a bad guy. So he's saying that Chris Hayes called that kind of analysis adolescent. That's what he's saying. Those denunciation rituals, no matter how cathartic and applause-inducing, supplied no useful information about what actions the United States should or should not take when it came to this increasingly dangerous conflict. That was the purpose of so severely restricting discourse to those simple moral claims, to allow policymakers in Washington free rein to do whatever they wanted in the name of stopping Putin without being questioned. Indeed, as so often happens when war breaks out, anyone questioning U.S. political leaders instantly had their patriotism and loyalty impugned, unless one was complaining that the United States should become more involved in the conflict than it already was, a form of pro-war dissent that is always permissible in American discourse. With these discourse rules firmly implanted, those who attempted to invoke former President Barack Obama's own arguments about a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, here's what Barack Obama said. He said that Ukraine is a core Russian interest, but not an American one. And therefore, the United States should not risk confrontation with Moscow over Ukraine, where those people who say this is what Barack Obama says. And the people who are saying this now are widely maligned as Kremlin assets, if not agents. So if you say what Barack Obama said about this situation, they'll now call you a Kremlin asset. That's happening to everybody. Tucker Carlson, Tulsi Gabbard, Glenn Greenwald, Michael Tracy, myself. That's the game. And and here it is in the Atlantic. He shows you Obama's theory here is simple. Ukraine is there it is. So that's where it comes from. Okay. So if you agree with Barack Obama on Ukraine, they'll call you a Kremlin puppet. That's how propaganda works. Others who urge the United States to try to avert war through diplomacy by, for instance, formally vowing that NATO membership would not be offered to Ukraine and that Kiev would remain neutral in the new Cold War pursued by the West with Moscow, that faced the same set of accusations about their loyalty and peace. Anybody who was for peace or had an idea how to de-escalate this situation was their loyalty to the United States was always questioned and still is. Most taboo of all was any discussion of the heavy involvement of the United States in Ukraine becoming in 2014 up to the invasion. From micromanaging Ukrainian politics, that's what the United States did, to arming its military, that's what the United States did, to placing military advisors and intelligence officers on the ground to train its soldiers how to fight, that's what the United States did, all of which amounted to a form of de facto NATO expansion without the formal membership. As a result of the media's embracing of moral righteousness in lieu of debating these crucial geopolitical questions, the U.S. government has consistently and aggressively escalated its participation in this war with barely any questioning, let alone opposition to it. So they're not even asking questions in the corporate news, is what Glenn Greenwald's saying. They're not asking those questions of why are we there and what should we be doing there and what are our interests there. U.S. officials are boastfully leading the effort to collapse the Russian economy. Along with its NATO allies, the United States has flooded Ukraine with billions of dollars of sophisticated weaponry, with at least some of those arms ending up in the hands of actual neo-Nazi battalions integrated into the Ukraine government and military. It is providing United States is providing surveillance technology in the form of drones and its own intelligence to enable Ukrainian targeting of Russian forces. President Biden threatened Russia with a response in kind if Russia were to use chemical weapons. Meanwhile, reports the New York Times, the New York Times is report. What a weird way to write. Meanwhile, reports the New York Times, CIA officers are helping to ensure that crates of weapons are delivered into the hands of vetted Ukrainian military units. The U.S. is, by definition, waging a proxy war against Russia, using Ukrainians as their instrument, with the goal of not ending the war, but prolonging it. That's what the United States is doing. So obvious is this fact about U.S. objectives that even the New York Times last Sunday explicitly reported that the Biden administration seeks to help Ukraine lock Russia in a quagmire. Surveying all this evidence, as well as discussions with his own U.S. and British sources, Niall Ferguson, writing in Bloomberg, proclaimed, "I conclude that the United States intends to keep this war going. The UK officials similarly told him that the UK's number one option is for the conflict to be extended and thereby bleed Putin. In sum, the Biden administration is doing exactly that which former President Obama warned in 2016 should never be done, risking war between the world's two largest nuclear powers over Ukraine. Yet if any pathology defines the last 5 years of U.S. mainstream discourse, it is that any claim that undercuts the interests of the U.S. liberal elites, no matter how true that claim is dismissed as Russian disinformation, just like Hunter's laptop. Whatever else is true, the U.S. and Russia are now in waters uncharted since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Even the savage U.S.-USSR proxy wars of the 1980s in Latin America and Afghanistan did not entail these sorts of rapidly escalating threats. A Russian president who, validly or not, feels threatened by NATO expansion in the region and driven by questions of his legacy on the other side of the U.S. president with a long record of hawkishness and a war fever, which is now hobbled by the carelessness and infirmities of old age, is a remarkably volatile combination. As former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis put it on Saturday, a U.S. president who, during an atrocious war, does not mean what he says on matters of war and peace and must be corrected by his hyperventilating staff is a clear and present danger to everyone. Hovering above all these grave dangers is the question of why. What interest does the U.S. have in Ukraine? What are sufficiently vital or substantial to justify trifling with the risks of a frickin' nuclear war? Why did the U.S. not do more to try to diplomatically avert this horrific war, instead seemingly opting for the opposite, namely discouraging Ukrainian President Zelensky from pursuing such peace talks on the alleged grounds of futility and rewarding Russian aggression, and not even exploring whether a vow of non-NATO membership for Ukraine would suffice? Let me bring in Caleb. Caleb, let me pose these questions to you. Why did the U.S. not try more to de-escalate this situation? What do you say?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it is the strategy of the United States to isolate Russia. And this war and provoking it and doing everything they can to kind of force this situation has been what has led to their ability to do so. And we're seeing that. They've been able to more effectively isolate Russia as a result of this. The people of Donetsk and Lugansk waited for 8 years. They wanted Russia to recognize their independence. And Russia said no. They said fulfill the Minsk Accords. And they facilitated the Minsk Agreement. And they tried to get recognition by the U.S.-backed Ukrainian government. For 7 years, they waited for the Minsk Accords to be fulfilled, and they weren't. That whole time, they were being bombed and shelled and facing a food blockade.
And let me explain to people what the Minsk Accords are.
Sure. Well, after 2014, when the USA toppled the elected government of Yanukovych in Kiev, and they installed a fanatically anti-Russian government, the people in the eastern regions of Ukraine, in Donbass, they declared independence. They set up the Donetsk People's Republic, the People's Republic of Lugansk, and they wanted separation. And they asked Russia to recognize them. And at that point, there was negotiations they called the Minsk Accords, in which the government in Kiev agreed to start bringing the people of the eastern regions back into politics, recognize their right to speak the Russian language, just bring them back in. And Russia sat back and said, no, we don't want to recognize you as independent countries. We want to bring you back into Ukraine. Let Ukraine bring you back in, as they promised to do in the agreements. But it's been 7 years, and those agreements haven't been fulfilled, and people have been dying around the clock. And it's very clear that Russia waited and waited and waited and waited, and the threats and the escalation and the piling of U.S. weapons into Kiev continued, and the attacks and shelling and bombing and drone strikes against the people in the eastern regions continued, and now we're in the situation that we're in.
And what do you make of Zelensky? So a lot of people have said that what the United States and NATO is doing is they're sacrificing the people of Ukraine to get slaughtered. And why would Zelensky go along with that? The president of Ukraine. Why would he go along with that? Because the U.S. and NATO, they don't really give a shit about Ukrainian people. They care about, energy transfers and the economic interests and things like that. They don't really care about people at all. So why would Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, go along with the United States?
Well, on the first point that you made there, I just have to agree with you. There's all this moralizing about Ukraine right now. The hearts of all the world, we're supposed to care about the people of Ukraine. If you care about the people of Ukraine, you wouldn't be plotting to turn their homeland into a long-term battlefield against Russia, right? If you care about the people of Ukraine, you would be trying to end this conflict as quickly as possible, which is not what Joe Biden is doing as he pours gasoline on it with threats to topple the Russian president, etc. But if you get down to it, Zelensky was elected as a peace candidate. He was elected because most Ukrainians want to de-escalate this. And he was elected as a repudiation of the more extreme right-wing anti-Russian forces in the country. But he wasn't able to fulfill the platform he got elected on because at the end of the day, he doesn't really have the power. There are these extremist groups that the U.S. media denies, the Azov Battalion, the Right Sector, etc. And there's just a lot of straight up management of Ukraine by the NATO countries, by foreign policy NGOs that have set up in Kiev. He doesn't have the power. He's a puppet. People say that this is a war against an independent country. Ukraine's independence ended in 2014 when the USA toppled the elected government. And since then, basically, Ukraine has just been a NATO military base pointed at Russia and doing everything it can to provoke some kind of Russian response to its actions. And now that response is happening, and they're acting like this came from nowhere.
So let me ask you this question. What interest does the United States have in Ukraine that are sufficiently vital or substantial to justifying trifling with the risks of this magnitude?
Well, there's no interest for us. I mean, average Americans aren't gaining from this in any conceivable way. But there are big oil companies and big natural gas companies who see Russia as a competitor, right? When Russia was poor and starving in the 90s and falling apart, Bill Clinton loved Boris Yeltsin. Everything was great. But when Putin got in and he rebuilt their economy, restructuring it around government-controlled oil and gas, at that point, Russia was selling oil on the international markets, selling natural gas on the international markets in competition with ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron. And ever since then, there's been tension. They see Russia as a competitor on the international stage. They don't like that. They want the world to remain centered around Wall Street and London. They want those oil profits. They want those natural gas profits. And they don't like the fact that Russia is in on the business.
And so when Glenn Greenwald asked the question, how does growing U.S. involvement in the war benefit the people of the United States, particularly as they were already before this war weighed down by the dual burdens of pandemic-based economic deprivations and rapidly escalating inflation, so that the answer to that is, how does this growing U.S. involvement in this war benefit the people? You would say it doesn't benefit us at all.
No. This is like Walmart. When Walmart comes to a town, it drops its prices. It puts all the local stores out of business. The people who work at all the local stores lose their jobs. They wipe out their competitors. And then once their competition is wiped out, then the prices go back up, right? And this is how monopolism works. This is monopolistic capitalism. They don't like that Russia is a competitor. They don't like that China has risen up from poverty. They don't want competition. That's really all this gets down to. Russia is now a competitor, just like China is a competitor, just like other countries around the world are competitors, and they don't want that competition. They want to dominate the world market, and they want to drive down living standards in order to do so. And this pandemic has presented them with a great opportunity. I mean, this is the monopolistic forces based in the Western countries kind of dictating policy and trying to drive the world into greater poverty in order to secure their profits.
So do you think we'll ever ask those questions? Do you think, as Glenn Greenwald says, it's too late to ask those questions? It might be too late to have those questions meaningfully examined, like why are we there? What are our interests? What are we willing to, our involvement levels? Do you think we'll ever have that kind of discussion in the United States?
Well, mainstream media isn't going to have those conversations.
Right.
And everything we've seen from mainstream media lately has been nothing but the most blatant, blind support for U.S. foreign policy. I mean, this is, I mean, it's a lot like when the USA went into Iraq, but even then there was at least some criticism you heard. But this is really, really blatant. But at the same time, beneath the surface, there are a lot of Americans that are more upset about the rising price of gas, more upset about the rising price of food, wondering why the roads are crumbling, wondering why the power grid in Texas collapsed last winter during an exceptionally cold winter. And at that point, there's a lot of Americans saying, why aren't we worried about the problems in our own backyard and what's going on here in the United States than what's going on the other side of the world? As much as they want to pluck our heartstrings. Look, Jimmy, when it gets down to it, most people are good, okay? If you hear about someone being harmed on the other side of the planet, you hear about a child starving or a family fleeing as refugees, you want to help them. And that's good. Most people care about other people. Most people have empathy and kindness. But the sad thing is that the most evil people, these war hawks, Samantha Power and other forces, Victoria Nuland, have figured out how to use media to manipulate these really good, compassionate, altruistic sentiments on the part of people to build a case for war. And what always happens? Are the Libyans any better off, right? They cared so much about those Libyans. They had to get rid of Gaddafi. Look at Libya now. What about the Iraqis? What about the people of Syria as they've been funding extremists there? The people never benefit from this, but they're very good at getting the emotions going and manipulating our basic human solidarity. It's really, really sinister. These must be very, very cynical people at the end of the day.
So let me ask you this. So So even France's president, Emmanuel Macron, he warned on Sunday against a verbal escalation over Russia's invasion in Ukraine after Joe Biden branded Vladimir Putin a butcher who cannot remain in power. And I would not use that kind of language, he said. If a ceasefire is to be brokered, we must not escalate, neither through words nor actions. And now Zelensky says Ukrainian President Zelensky said on Sunday that a Russian demand of Ukrainian neutrality, a key issue for Moscow at conflict negotiations, was being closely looked at by Kiev's negotiators. The point of the negotiation is understandable to me, and it is being discussed. It is being carefully studied, said Zelensky. Now, first of all, why is he studying? What is there to study, and why isn't he just going forward with it?
Well, look, I think that at the end of the day, Zelensky is trying to do a balancing act because while he doesn't have the power, there's a lot of these NATO allies that aren't fully where Joe Biden's at. Joe Biden is trying to escalate this. You can interpret this as just an old man and gaffes, but if that's the case, he needs to resign because this is a serious situation. And if you don't know how to clearly articulate policy, you shouldn't be in office. I think, honestly, that what's going on here is they're hiding behind Joe Biden's sleepy Joe old man reputation, and they're trying to make threats that they can then walk back and not be held accountable for. I think that that's what's going on here, because if this is just a straight up incompetence, it's something pretty unbelievable. But at the end of the day, Zelensky, the NATO countries are guiding him, but not all the NATO countries are fully on board with this. Germany was very reluctant. They just built that Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline. They were ready to start buying natural gas from Russia, and now we have this crisis, and all of a sudden they can't do it. And France has got questions as well. And I think a lot of the countries specifically on the European mainland are asking themselves, why are we escalating with Russia at this point? What do we benefit from it? And a lot of people have just got to be asking, okay, it's one thing, you don't approve of Russia, whatever, but why should we import natural gas all the way from the United States, all the way from the other side of the planet, when we can get it over the border from Russia? We built this special pipeline to Germany. What is going on here? And they have to ask themselves, is going along with Washington's latest moralistic crusade, is this really in our interests?
Caleb, why does Germany go so? Well, you know what? Let's talk about it in the next segment, because our next segment is about the gas deal, and I want to talk about the Nord Stream pipeline when it comes to that. But let me just ask you to close out this segment, how do you think it's going to end up? Everybody knows how this has to end up, meaning that Ukraine has to go back to being a neutral actor, right? And they have to stop shelling the people in the Donbass, meaning Ukraine government has to stop killing those people. And so how do you think it's going to end up?
Well, my hope is that the government in Kiev will recognize that the people of the eastern regions who wanted to be part of Ukraine, that basically if they're not going to have that, then they have the right to independence, and recognize that, look, if we're not going to treat you with respect, we're going to keep attacking you and not let you be part of Ukrainian society. I guess you can be independent. And if the Donbass regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, if their independence is recognized and Ukraine is going to agree to not join NATO and not keep piling U.S. weapons in there, I think this could end. Unfortunately, it seems like the strategy of the United States is, as you read in the Glenn Greenwald article, they're trying to set up for a long-term conflict. They want this to be the new Afghanistan. They want Russians to be in Ukraine, fighting and dying for year after year after year. But I think Moscow knows this as well, and they're not going to go along with that, and et cetera. So my hope is that that forces in Europe, forces in Kiev that don't want this conflict to continue will say, look, Lugansk, Donetsk, we'll leave them alone. And at that point, this can all be de-escalated. Unfortunately, that is not the goal of the United States. And the scary thing is that the training of these extremist forces, not the Ukrainian military, but these Azov battalion, right fanatics, these folks. I mean, look at some of the photos. I know you can't show them on here of what they're doing in the areas that they take over, where they're torturing people, they're targeting people on the basis of their ethnicity, Roma people, others. I mean, what they're doing is just horrendous. U.S. media is just covering up real atrocities, executing prisoners of war, just executing prisoners of war. We only hear one side of the story. We only hear allegations against Russia, but the documented facts of what these extreme forces that have gotten CIA and U.S. National Guard training over the past few years are doing is really, really horrendous. And I don't know if Zelensky will be able to completely control those forces. And that may be what the forces that want a long-term conflict are depending on. It may be that Zelensky and other forces are ready to end this, but these extremist elements that they have cultivated don't.
Do you think Zelensky's afraid that Nazis will kill him if he makes a deal?
Oh, sure. I mean, ever since he got elected, they've been having protests against him. They've been having torch-lit marches that look a lot like, Charlottesville, where they're marching and calling for a new Euromaidan. They consider him to be a traitor. They say that he's not really Ukrainian because he's Jewish, etc. Those far-right forces have been threatening him and calling for his ouster from the beginning. And they have a lot of influence in the military, and the United States has been giving them a lot of support.
Hey, we're doing our live stand-up tour. We're going to be in Orlando. We're going to be in Tampa, Columbus, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, much, much more. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all the tickets. And you can come see our shows in Los Angeles, too. We do one weekly. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com and become a premium member while you're there. Get all the extra content. Thank you.